Hello and welcome to Learning Outcome Leaders, brought to you by Genium. I'm James and I'm Scott, and on this podcast, you'll hear us chatting to higher education professionals who can talk the talk about how they've been there and done it. We'll discuss some of their proudest and most ambitious projects and explore the most effective ways in which they've helped to improve and elevate their students' experience. In this episode, we're joined by David Evans, former VP at USAO, to discuss his philosophy on reducing institutional friction to stop students from quitting out of frustration. We'll analyse the economics of retention, including how a small emergency fund pays for itself and why some students are choosing high-interest credit cards over federal loans. Want to find out more? Let's get into the episode.
Delightful. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess to sort of kick it off, it'd be really great to just hear what your origin story is coming into education. What was your sort of formative education experience?
Sure. Well, this is kind of an interesting question. My mom was a professor and my dad was a lawyer. And so those were kind of the pathways. And on my father's side, there's a fairly long history of people involved in academics. His aunt, my great aunt, was the first person in the United States to get a doctorate in theater. So that was kind of a tradition too. My father's father was a lawyer, so that was his side. And so when I went to college, I was kind of thinking about both of those things. And I initially intended to be a lawyer. And I started out as a political science major in college. And I didn't like that. And this is an embarrassing but funny story. Both of the intro politics classes at my undergraduate college met at 8 and 8:20 in the morning. And when I was 18, I really couldn't manage that. So, and the earliest English classes started at 9:40. So I thought, well, this is good. And my advisor said, well, an English major is perfectly fine to go to law school, so don't worry about that. But then in the summer between my sophomore and junior year, I spent a month at Cambridge at Trinity Hall on a program that at that time was run by UCLA. I don't know if it still is or not, but and I thought, I really need a job that enables me to do things like this all the time. And I thought, well, and I love being an English major. I loved reading and writing. So I just decided I'm going to go to grad school in English, and that's what I ended up doing. And then I've done the regular thing of being a faculty member and then an administrator. Um, and I've never really regretted it. When I was in graduate school, I worked as a legal proofreader for a couple of years, which is, as you know, the way lawyers used to be educated. Uh, I'm working in a law office someplace, and I learned a tremendous amount, and I'm grateful for that. But at the same time, uh, it was pretty boring. Um, so, so I'm glad I ended up not doing that. And since then, I've been really, really interested, and of course, this is what you all want to talk about. Increasingly interested in ways to increase student success. My own education was pretty elite. I went to one of the top liberal arts colleges in the country, and then I went to grad school at the University of Virginia, which is, especially in the humanities, a very strong institution. And so I was sort of snobbish at the beginning. But my wife is a first generation college student, and she's the sixth of 10 children, uh, rural Iowa family. And they all have been very, very successful, but it's helped me see the barriers that go into uh, what happens to you as a student if you are not from a place where it's taken for granted that you're going to go to college and even grad school. I mean, my parents didn't save to send me to college; they saved to send me to graduate school, which kind of tells you how I grew up. Um, and so that's more and more been what I've been interested in throughout my career, because I think that students who are, first generation or from lower income, um, various other kinds of headwinds that they might face. Um, First of all, the value added that an institution can give to them is higher. Secondly, the social good that comes out of that part of higher education is just so important in terms of equity and in terms of providing economic opportunity for people. So that's where I have been lately, and think that that's important, and I find it gratifying, even though clearly it's a lot more challenging than serving the kind of very well prepared, financially comfortable population of students that are pretty typical of where I went to undergraduate.
That's it's really good to hear that you've like your exposure to like students or like your like you said your wife it being a first gen graduate, like exposure to that has made you like look inwards of like where you can focus that support. I think so. I'm a first gen graduate, and I think there's so many different experiences that first gens have. Like I'm the first. I went to university, um, just because I was stubborn, right? I was like, no one else in my family has done this. I'm gonna do it, right? And I did it. And they were like, look, we're not going to be able to help you with much. Like, we don't have much experience in this, so you're out there on your own. I'm like, yeah, I don't need your help. I can do it all far myself. I desperately needed help, but I was so stubborn. I didn't ask for any help. But then I've spoken to people who are like first gen graduates, and they were like, there was so much pressure put on them, right? To be the first person. Like, you're so clever, you're the most smartest in the family, you're gonna go to university. And then they've seen like struggles from the the element of pressure when it comes to being a first gen, whereas I saw struggles because I was too stubborn. So there's like so many different like
It's good.
yeah, and like what when you work with like first gen graduates now or first gen students now, what are like some of the common things that you see come up, and why are you most interested in like helping that section?
Well, I think you've kind of implied some of it already in your comment. Uh, One of the major things I think is universities and colleges are in the way they sort of work are kind of black boxes, not just to students, but in some ways to faculty and other people who work at them, which strikes me pretty constantly. People don't know how budgets work and that sort of thing. Um, but I think, if you just say, go to the registrar's office or, file your FAFSA for people in the United States. What is that? I mean, what are these things? How do you do them? How do you navigate this? And that's one part of it. Is institutional processes are I mean, I think they're pretty mysterious to almost anybody, but they're mysterious and frustrating, I think, to people who don't just sort of naturally feel like they belong. And I think a lot of first generation students don't feel in one way or another that they belong, whether they've got imposter syndrome or some other thing that's going on with them. And what I've found, and we're really working on that here at USAO, it's kind of my mantra, is you just have to reduce institutional friction. And you have to make it clear and explicit and as easy as you possibly can for students to navigate these things, financial aid, registration, all that sort of thing. And it's hard because, again, if you're an insider, you just sort of take it for granted that people know this stuff, and they don't. And again, I think one of the things, and Scott, you may have some familiarity with this from your own experience. You may have kind of a tentative grip on your desire to go to college or to go to university. And so every little thing that you bump into that's discouraging is kind of another brick in the wheelbarrow of, not thinking it's for you, not feeling like you want to keep doing it. And I think that's a really tough thing. Uh, so I think a lot of what an institution that serves a lot of first generation students and a lot of students who have financial need and so on need to do is just make sure that those processes are easy and friction free, um, so that students don't bump into those things that what when they encounter it, they say, well, I'm just done with this. It's too much. I'm spending all this money. I don't have a clear outcome. I could be working, and making reasonably good money doing this sort of thing, whatever it might be. Um, that happens a lot, I think. And students who leave will pretty much always tell you it's financial, in my experience, and that I think is because they're raised not to hurt people's feelings, so they won't say, well, my experiences in the financial aid office have just been absolutely horrible, so I just can't deal with it anymore, or so they won't say that, or my advisor's a psychopath. They won't do that. um and so they'll say, well, I just can't afford to keep doing it, I need to work. But that's I mean, it's very often a factor, but it's certainly a lot less of a factor than it would show up in things like surveys.
Yeah, I think it's like that financial element is the easiest thing, right? To put it down to the easiest thing for them to explain.
And you didn't have to go into it at all. Nobody will say, well, what happened in the registrar? I mean, people will say, what happened in the registrar's office? What happened in the financial aid office? But people will never say, well, why don't you just work more hours or something? I mean, nobody who's not insane would ever say something like that. So you have a very easy, you're right, Scott, is an easy pathway to um, just shutting the door. And I mean, I think it's really unfortunate, and institutions have been indifferent, I think, to this. And when things were thriving in higher education in the United States, and I mean, my mom started as a faculty member in 1959. And so, right before the baby boom started to go to college, and it was, there was just no problem, in terms of getting enrollment and all that kind of thing. It was fine. And so the systems that were developed by that generation of faculty and administration were kind of indifferent to customer satisfaction, which is a term that I don't love, but it sort of didn't matter if some kid came to college and couldn't figure out how to make it. Well, too bad. There was always somebody else waiting to take that place. And now that's most definitely not true here, and I know it's not true in the UK either. Um, so there's both a pragmatic reason just from institutional survival and a philosophical reason, which is the idea of equity and access for students who really should be able to, as long as they have the will to do it, they should be able to make it through without a lot of impediments from the institution.
Yeah, yeah, I completely agree. I think that we should be doing everything we can to remove these barriers to help them get through to education and complete education. I think that brings us on really nicely to the approach which you've taken at like three of your institutions now. You've told us a little bit about it via email. Do you want to give us a little top level overview for the listeners and for us again, and then we can dig deeper into it a little bit?
Sure. Well, I've worked at three institutions that were more or less explicitly access institutions, and served a high percentage of first gen students, high percentage of financially needy students, and that sort of thing. So all of what we've already talked about in terms of processes and barriers and things is part of it. But the other thing that we've done at each of these places, and we're working on a very large project on that now here at the University of Science and Arts of Oklahoma, is really intensive work on data with the incoming class to identify the areas of risk. And so you develop a profile, and this works really well at a small school. I don't know how you do it at a giant university, but you really look at an individual student level at the things that are potentially problematic and barriers to them. And this ranges from what high school they went to. I mean, we have records about the levels of success from students from different high schools. So you can tell a student with a 3.2 grade point average from this one is going to be fine. A student with a 3.2 grade point average from that one is going to need support. So that financial risk factors, first gen, um, test scores, we're test optional, but about 3/4 of our students do it anyway. So we have that data. And you really sort of develop those groups, and you try to design some interventions for them. And sometimes it's at the level of just informing their advisor, uh, these are things X, Y, and Z are potential concerns for this student. And we have an advising center here. We have a professional advising center that advises first-year students. So that's relatively easy. There are 4 staff members who do advising for the incoming students, so they know them, um, and they get that data and can really intervene. Um, and again, we've done that at the university where I was the academic vice president, like I am here, at Southern Vermont College, where I was the president. And again, here we're working this up right now. Um, the University of Oklahoma, which is huge, is only about 40 miles from us, but they've done some really good work on student retention, and they have developed a kind of predictive model. And one of our people, who is now, he's a math faculty member, but he has a special job, which is data retention analyst, or a retention data analyst. He's been working with them to really find the points where the interventions have the most return. Um, we've talked to the people at OU several times, and one of the interesting things that they've found is some of the things that they thought would be predictive are really not. And some of the things that they thought were relatively indifferent predictors actually are pretty important. And so we're trying to figure that out here. I mean, we're in the kind of early middle stages of that, I would say. But we're trying to figure out where we can best put our limited resources to support those students and help them be successful.
I find it quite interesting to sort of, I guess, two-pronged question is, obviously a lot of these students will still be quite a big intersectionality between different challenges that one student might present, whether that be financial. As a result, they're a working student, so then they're a time poor student. On top of that, they might also be, first generation, etc. So I guess, how do you look at that as a way to sort of prioritize what challenges you want to try and support first, and then what does some of that practical support look like when you've got that almost menu of support that you might have on offer for those students? How do you go about finding that, and what's on that menu?
Well, you mentioned time poor students, and we have a lot of our students work, and a lot of our students work a lot. We are relatively inexpensive. The total cost of attendance, if you paid full price here with residence hall and everything, is about $15,000 a year, which in the United States is really, really low. Um, but we still have a lot of students who need to work a lot. So one thing that we've been struggling with, because we're kind of under resourced in the faculty, we don't have as many faculty as we really ought to, is course scheduling. But one of the things that happens to students who need to work is, if their courses are scattered across the entire week, it makes them very difficult. It makes it very difficult for them to do that. So last year we started to do this, and as we get better with analytics, this I think is going to help. Um, Try to schedule classes in such a way that it eliminates as many conflicts as we can. And this is also not just general access, but it's time to degree, right? If they can't get what they need, they end up graduating in 5 years instead of 4, and there's all the opportunity costs that go along with that. So we're trying to structure that, and that one's nice because it doesn't cost anything. It's just, well, it costs something because it costs a lot in brain power and faculty and staff time, but it doesn't actually require an outlay of money, I guess I would say. So that's one that we're working on. Um, Another small thing, and the our chief financial officer just went to be the chief financial officer of the Board of Regents, which was sort of sad because he was really committed to this. But he set aside a relatively small amount of money, something like $60,000, as just an emergency fund. Because you've mentioned things like work. Um, students who don't have a lot of money tend to drive kind of lousy cars. So something like a flat tire might impede them from going to work, which would in turn impede them from having the money to pay their bills and, eat and all those kind of things. And sometimes it's really just a couple $100 that they need to sort of overcome this and keep going. So we have that fund now. And this was Georgia State University, which is in downtown Atlanta, did kind of an intensive study of this a few years ago and found that it increased their graduation rate some ridiculous amount, like 6 percentage points. Uh, just this relatively little amount of money is a way to do that. So we've implemented that. That's really good. We're continuing to work on advising and thinking about the best way we can advise. And this is really to reduce barriers. Again, improper advising causes a lot of problems, right? You either have to waive requirements, or you have to have students stay longer, or you have to do special arrangements, all of which are not so great. And we have some state requirements, especially in general education, that I can't waive. We cannot waive them. We can waive any of our internal things that we want to, but the state rules we cannot. So you want to make sure you avoid that. We're also looking at, what kind of programming in terms of a first year seminar, which we're ambivalent about the version of it that we do now, but what kind of programming can help our students understand our resources and how to employ our resources and how to make wise decisions. Um, so another thing that we did last year, which was interesting and scary, is we have a lot of students who pay their bills with credit cards. And, this is fine if you're getting miles or something for it, right? And then you just pay it off. But our chief financial officer and our financial aid person and some other people did some questioning of these students. And a lot of times it was because they didn't want to take federal student loans. And federal student loans have all kinds of problems in the United States. I don't want to gloss over any of that. But the interest rate's like 6%, and the credit card is, 23% or something like that. Why are you doing that? And here in Oklahoma, it's because people don't trust the government. It's, quite a right-wing state. And so there's a lot of suspicion of anything that has to do with government program. But, that's just a bad decision. The so so more education about that. How do you convince people that this is a much better idea and a much better deal than than just putting it on the MasterCard or whatever. So that's another part of it. Um and so this is where we are now. We also did a student survey before I got here. I've been here about a year and a half. Um, and it became really clear from both our student survey and our faculty and staff survey that our mental health support was nowhere near good enough. So we've hired a full-time counselor, and we had somebody who worked in our disability accommodations office who'd also finished a master's degree in counseling, but had to have the supervised clinical hours to get her license. So we hired our counselor to with in mind the idea that she could be the clinical supervisor for the accommodations person. So we got a full-time counselor, and then we got, more or less 3/4 of another full-time counselor through this clinical program. So that's helped us a lot too. Although they are both completely booked, which suggests to me that we need even more there. Um, but you try to be strategic because we just can't spend money like this. But if you can save six, like with the fund, the emergency fund, if you save 6 students from the financial standpoint, it pays for itself. Um, and I think the president and I and a couple of the other people on the leadership team um, have decided that that's the way to make these calculations, right? I don't think people earlier at the university were doing that. I don't think they were thinking about it anything as an investment. They were thinking about everything as an expense. Um, and I think that that has changed. So we're trying to fix that now.
It's it's interesting that you just referenced there as like saving 6 students plays for the effort you put in to do that. I think that's how most institutions should be looking. Like the student themselves that benefit from finishing the course, like having that degree, going on to a good career, but the institution itself benefits from keeping that student there as well, just by giving these simple things. Like it sounds love the idea of the flat tire fund. Like that's amazing. It's like such a holistic, like out the box type like thinking that these small things will pile up, right? And
Well, and the thing is, they'll always remember that too. And some of your alumni are going to do really well. And so to me, it seems like kind of a no-brainer. And just on a little bit different track, but related to this. So I was the interim president of the American University of Bulgaria in Bulgaria during the COVID pandemic. And a lot of we had about 70% students from Bulgaria. And it is, uh, to borrow a cliche from you guys, it's a nation of shopkeepers. And so a lot of families of our students, ran restaurants or little shops or all those kinds of things. And COVID was disastrous for those businesses. You know, there was there were several months in Bulgaria where the government only allowed banks, pharmacies, grocery stores, and liquor stores to stay open. And so if you ran a restaurant or any kind of other little store or whatever, you were not making any money. And so we raised it was around $1.5 million to create a student emergency fund, and it was done by application. We appointed a committee, and we had it done that way. But we just by application basically just gave that money to students and said, we know that there are problems, and this is an emergency, and we applied that to them. And as a result of that, we had very little student attrition from financial reasons during the COVID pandemic because we were able to float them during that time. I mean, fortunately, Bulgaria is inexpensive, so it was less than it would be here in the US or in the UK, but we were able to do that. And then the same thing again happened with the Russian-Ukrainian war, because we had, at the time that it broke out, we had about 30 Ukrainian students and 20 Russian students. And among other things, the Russian students were cut off from the international banking system. I mean, that you may remember that happened right away. They just shut Russia off completely from the international banking system. So even if they had the money, they couldn't get it. And this was not just tuition and fees and stuff like that. This was groceries. They couldn't go to the ATM and get their money out or anything. So we again raised some money there with the help of some very generous foundations, especially to make sure that they might not have been particularly comfortable, but at least they were not starving. And again, I think institutions, colleges are made up of people. And I think you want to think about people first, and really the institution will be healthy if that's the sort of decision making matrix that you use. And again, it's an investment, right? Those Russian students, those Ukrainian students were able to stay. They pretty much all of them now have graduated because it's been 3 years. But they were able to stay. They were able to progress. Now they're off doing especially the Ukrainians, who I knew better than the Russians. Um, they're doing all kinds of interesting stuff, and they're working in London. They're in various things in the EU. You know, it could have been a disaster. I mean, it was a disaster, but it could have been a lot more of a disaster in terms of their future than it was, because for not all that much money, we were able to keep them going. Um, this seems really obvious to me. It's not all that obvious to higher education, I don't think, but it seems really obvious to me that, um, this is really in the most profound way an investment, both in the students themselves and in the future of the institution.
I think we've seen this real shift over the last few decades, where university is and always will be a competitive environment for students to get into university. But because of things like the enrollment cliff, it's actually now becoming more and more competitive between universities to get students, to retain those students. And I think these things, I almost liken it a little bit to, you go to a restaurant, you have a good experience, you'll tell one person. You go to a restaurant, you have a bad experience, you'll tell five. And I think, and so even for a student to then come in to a university, maybe they have mental health struggles. If they go to a university that's invested in that, then that's going to help them stay. They're going to tell people about that. The same then goes for things like this emergency fund, where all of a sudden you're actually then using this as a way to get students to enroll in the future, because that next generation is knowing that, oh, my cousin went to that university and it was fantastic. They had a flat tire once, and do you know, the university paid for that to get them back into school. It's no money, but all of a sudden it's not just that one student, and we look at the students that might have been the six saved per year. By the time we're a decade away from that, of that happening, that number is really multiplied. So I think it's the longer term return on investment as well it's a no-brainer, but it's very difficult to get to that mental shift uh, as
Yep.
well.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's even more right for small institutions than it is for large institutions. So here, in Oklahoma, the University of Oklahoma is an enormously huge brand. Gigantic American football team. Basketball, all the things that go with a great big university. And it's quite a good school too. So that's nice. I mean, you can get a lot of advantages going there. Um, so people are just automatically kind of gravitating there. And again, and there's also an incentive to graduate from there, because it's the pathway to the power structure. I mean, it's like, this is not a really entirely fair comparison, but it's like Oxbridge, right? Where if you go there and do reasonably well, you make all kinds of connections and get to do all kinds of cool things. Um, and so for us, um, we have a different thing to sell, and a different thing to add value. And so for us, it's um, making those pathways and creating those pathways. And James, you're absolutely right about word of mouth. Um, a lot of our students are from small towns. They go to small high schools. Um, they have younger siblings, they have friends, and if they have a great experience, they will say that, and if they have a bad experience, you're absolutely right. They'll tell a lot more people about that. Um, and the same thing was true in Bulgaria. I mean, Bulgaria is a very tight-knit society in some kinds of ways. And, so there are these pathways that students have, and we found that we had one Palestinian student, for example. When I got there, we had one Palestinian student who was amazingly talented and just great in a whole variety of ways. Um all of a sudden, a few years later, we have like 17 Palestinian students. And the same thing happened with Mongolia. It happened with Georgia, the country, not the state here. Um, you know, and it's just so fundamental to institutional success. Again, especially for a smaller school, a school that's not, Harvard or Cambridge or, MIT or something like that. Um, it's so essential, and people will know if your institution has that commitment. And if that commitment becomes kind of part of your brand story, um, it will help you be successful even with the enrollment cliff and things like that.
100%.
So all of this work around collating all the data from students coming in, and then designing methods to be able to support like specific students or specific subsets of students. There must be challenges that come into that. When you're like collecting, or not collecting is probably not the right word. Like when you're like collating all of this data and like putting it together to try and figure out what are some of the things that are most difficult to like work through, and then when putting together specific supports, what are the challenges in terms of like picking the specific support that you want to do, or just getting stuff in place?
Um, a lot of it is getting something in place. Um, we are not outstanding at building systems here. And so um, that's a little bit hard. And one particular part of this that I think is especially salient. So I mentioned earlier, we have an advising center that does our first year students. Um, that met with a tremendous amount of resistance from faculty. And faculty really like at least the mentoring part of advising. I mean, I remember from being a faculty member, and I haven't been a full faculty member for 25 years, but I advised beyond that time. It's really fun to talk to students and talk about what they want to do and kind of strategize about grad school and all those sorts of things. I mean, it's one of the better parts of the job. Um, but w- advising has become increasingly technical for a variety of reasons. Um, and, programs are a little more complicated. And here I've mentioned our resource constraints in terms of faculty. So there are sequences of courses that if you miss it, you're not going to get it until the next time it comes around, which may be 2 years later, which is a huge obstacle. And so um, we're working on advancing and making more comprehensive that advising center. And the faculty don't, well, some of the faculty, to be fair, don't like it. They want to be advisors. But unfortunately, you get a very uneven result from faculty advising because some of them are great and some of them are not. And so you wind up, and this goes back to one of those friction points that I was talking about, where you get advising errors, and you get a student who applies for graduation in what they think is their last semester, and it turns out that they need 3 more courses. I mean, they got enough hours, but they don't have enough courses, or they don't have, they haven't met some requirements or whatever. Now, we're addressing that partly by implementing a new student information system, and hopefully that'll help with that. But, you know, you just can't have that for all the reasons we've already discussed. You just can't have that. And faculty are, and this is ubiquitous, this isn't just here, faculty are generally pretty resistant to things like advising training. I'm an English professor. I didn't go to graduate school to learn about, how to advise general education or whatever. Um, so we're working on that transition. So that's an implementation challenge, right? I mean, we've decided to do it. We just need to kind of sell it to the community in a way that it's going to work. So that's one. The other thing is, how do you get, if you identify these interventions and if they're not necessarily at the individual level, but they're at the kind of population level, how do you address those things, and here's an example for that. So we are a Native American serving non-tribal institution. Between 25 and 30% of our students are Native American. We're right in the middle of the Chickasaw Nation. Our land is from the Chickasaw back in the 19th century. So, we're very much embedded in that, which is a big thing in Oklahoma. So we have money from the federal government for this, and one of the things that we have is a financial counselor, who is not part of the financial aid office. This is completely separate, and this is a person who's properly trained, about all these kinds of issues. Getting students to use her services is really hard. Again, it goes back to, for example, that thing about using credit cards instead of student loans. Um, and you can do things like create seminars or something like that, but if the students don't come to them, it doesn't do any good. So how do you fold it in such a way that it reaches the people it needs to reach? And my experience has been with a lot of things, with these services, in a broad brush way, the people who need them the most are the ones who are least likely to avail themselves of them. And this is just kind of a human nature thing, right? How do you how do you get your students to recognize and be willing to do the things that would really help them, and ultimately would be not painful, but actually helpful and maybe even comforting. But how do you get them to sort of jump that barrier to do those things? So I mean, in the broadest sense, that's another implementation problem, um, and one that, if I really had the answer, I would make a lot of money and retire. Uh, but I mean, you just need to work at that, and it's messaging. It's again, it's the touch point. So it's advising, it's admissions, it's the financial aid office. Have you thought of this? We have this person who can talk to you about this, and it won't leak over into your financial aid conversation at all. It's a completely separate thing, separate office. Go talk. We have a college counselor. Why don't you go and talk to her about this challenge that you're facing? All those kinds of things. And again, it's a culture question in the broadest sense. Need work.
Like it kind of it hits home for me a little bit. Like being first gen, having dyslexia, and just being a stubborn boy. I wish someone would just sit me down and at university and just gone, you can have access to these things that would make life so much easier for you. And you told it to me straight. Because I refused so much stuff. I knew it was there, but I didn't really like understand why it was going to help me. Like I just knew that if I could do this on my own, then I would feel better about myself. But if someone could just suck me out and just go, you're still going to be able to do this on your own, but you're going to do it better because you have these things in place. Uh, yeah, it hits home.
Well, and there's a lot of, and you've described this. There's a lot of pride involved in all of these things. And one thing, and I was talking to somebody else about this the other day about first gen status. In a lot of institutions, that's kind of hidden, And Scott, I don't know if that was your experience as an undergraduate. Um, One thing that we do here, and the head of our student success center, who is, I know Scott, you've talked to her. She's just so amazing. She is a first generation college student, and she didn't go here, but she's from this area. So she understands the culture, and she and some other people have uh, generated a lot of things. So we have a first generation celebration day. And you see a lot of our students, they have these T-shirts that say "First Generation Proud," and there's a national program. I don't know where else schools are doing this, but we do it in a pretty big way. So there's a special breakfast for them, and they get these cool T-shirts. And I actually snagged one of those T-shirts and gave it to my wife. And she was, again, as a first gen student, she went to the University of Iowa, so she went to one of these giant schools. She was, I think, kind of moved by it, that there was this sort of recognition. And I refused to wear one. They offered me one. I said, "Look, I'm not a first generation student. I'm not going to appropriate this identity." Um, but I think that's another thing, right? Is kind of taking it out of the shadows and saying, it's really okay. In fact, it's not just okay, it's awesome. You have crossed a border that's hard to cross. Congratulations. You've made a courageous decision to, try this thing that's unprecedented in your family. uh Bravo. And I loved it. It was really fun last year. I think it's in the early spring. It's like in February or something. But I'm really looking forward to that, because I think that, once again, that's something, not just okay, but hey, yeah, we're glad you're here. Good on you. And that again is something that I think is so important. It's like, yeah, the institution actually knows about this, thinks it's important, and cares about it. And that's another. I mean, I love that stuff, because again, I'm sensitive to the idea of kind of the total experience, and how that total experience, shapes everything that comes after. I mean, I think a good college experience does that for anybody who goes to college, but for students with these barriers, I think it's even more important. I mean, I always knew I was gonna go grad school. The people I went to college with pretty much all knew they were gonna make it. That was the least of anybody's worries. Now, this was in the '80s, so it was a different time too, but um there was just no doubt. It's like, yeah, sure, what the hell, be an art history major, because, you're going to college with all these smart people. There's gonna be a niche for you someplace. But I think, students who don't have the ability to have that kind of certainty, celebrating them in a different way is really, really important and helpful.
I love that. Turning something like that into a real moment of pride is huge. It's like, as a first gen student myself, it was something that was never talked about. I didn't know. I knew that I was struggling, but I didn't know that that might be one of the reasons why. And so being able to sort of highlight that in a positive way of, well, this is because you've already reached further than what your family has done in the past, and you're right at the forefront of your capabilities already. Is a really nice thing to be able to do. I guess, as we're sort of coming towards the end of this podcast, we're really, really enjoying this. I wish we could go for about 4 hours. I guess we've talked about a lot of the different support structures that you've already put in place, and this is always going to be something that is changing and evolving, and sort of being iterated on over time. It'd be good to sort of understand, what have you seen those real term sort of effects been on the student experience, so far, and what have those results looked like, so far?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at Southern Vermont, and I don't want to steal credit for something that I didn't do or wasn't really involved with, but our graduation rate, our 4-year graduation rate, had been somewhere in the vicinity of 27%. And in 2017, So about halfway through my time there, our graduation rate had gone up to 42%, which is still honestly not great, but it was 50% higher than it had been. And it was things that my predecessor and her team had done plus mine. Um, a lot of the things we've talked about in terms of interventions and stuff like that. So that was huge, right? I mean, that's a really big, important difference. Here, this really comprehensive effort started last year, and so it's not entirely clear what's happened yet. Although what I would say is, and it's hard to untangle causality on this, but just as an example, so last year, we had at this time about 240 first-time full-time students, and this year we have 281. And that maybe, James, goes back to at least partly some of the things that you talked about with word of mouth and things like that. Um, it will remain to be seen what happens in terms of retention and progression to graduation and that sort of thing. But it's a good leading sign. And I think the other thing is, um, and this is, you know, we've been talking about data, and I'm just going to throw all the data out the window and talk about buzz. You have kind of a positive buzz on campus, right? You have people engaged in things. So I went last night, for example, to our first volleyball game. Or it may have been our first home volleyball game. It may have been our second, but if it was our second, I missed the last one. And we are a very small school, about 1,000 students altogether, but there was a huge amount of students at the volleyball game yesterday. And there was a whole section of them doing cheers and all kinds of stuff. Well, volleyball is a little bit of an arcane sport. But there was this sort of feel. We lost, unfortunately, but there was this sort of feel in the gym of engagement, and this is another part of the whole recipe, right? Is if you have a campus experience that is positive and fun, it gives students something to look forward to, even if they're struggling academically or financially or whatever. So that was kind of nice too. And I think we'll see things like engagement in student clubs. This is a measure also. Um, but we're early days on this. We did with the emergency financial thing. It definitely made a difference for at least half a dozen students last year. No question about that. And of course, they're tracked individually, so we know who they are. Um, so that's happening. And again, it's so much of this is just about creating the atmosphere. And I can't say enough about how important that is. I mean, I think back to Bulgaria, had this incredible campus community, and we just were afraid with COVID that a bomb had been dropped on it, and it was going to take years to rebuild. So a lot of what we tried to do during we were navigating that was, keep that intact as much as we could. And I think we succeeded because they also are enjoying record freshman enrollment there this year. Um, it's again, it's kind of part of the whole thing. So every little bit, and we've mentioned this already, but every little thing is, kind of another feather on the scale that leads towards students being successful and, make them fond of the institution and fond of their time here. Um, so we'll see. And I'd be glad to talk to you in a year about how all these things have worked, because I think we're really this year, some of the stuff that we developed last year is gonna be happening this year. Uh, and I think that's gonna be nice.
Amazing. Amazing. Yeah, I mean, we would love to talk to you again in a year and see where stuff's gone. But before we wrap up, The reason for this podcast is to share information. It's for other people to know how they could do something like this. Throughout our conversation today, it's felt like it's been a lot of a mindset shift, I think, or just a certain mindset. What would you say to someone who's looking to do something similar? How would they go about doing this? Where would their head be? What would they need to do?
I I think you just have to really think students first. And you and this is a cliche, but one of the things is you have to teach and work with the students you have, even if you want a different kind of students. And I think at an institution like USAO or at an institution like Buena Vista or an institution like Southern Vermont, you have to be genuinely proud of what you're doing. Um, and and this goes to the whole, and sorry, this is another hobby horse of mine, but this goes to the whole economy of higher education, right? The 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 whole thing is really about prestige. And I remember early in my career being sort of depressed about that whole thing. Um, but the better way to go about it and the better way to, as a professional, develop a, sense of career satisfaction is to figure out what it is that you're really trying to do and then take pride in doing that well. So if you're not a professor at Harvard, well, there aren't a lot of professors at Harvard, be glad that you're doing this other thing. And that's where my own personal journey has been is, changing that mindset. And, my wife has a little bit beamed that into me, frankly, which is good. She's like, stop being such a snob. But I think that's really important. And I think the question is, and this has been in my role as a leader every place, what is going to do the best thing for the students that we have and how are they going to be helped? And it's whether it's academic things or whether it's stuff like the pandemic and identifying the problems that our population was going to have and figuring out a strategy to address those. I think that's really, really what you need to do. And if you're at a teaching institution, which we are, um, there's kind of no excuse for not doing it that way. And so that's my first question always is, what's going to work for the students? And this is not about coddling them. This is not about giving them things they don't deserve. It's none of the things that people say are bad about this approach. It's just about, thinking, who are our students and what's going to do good for them. And then doing the best you can to do that.
I love that. I think it's a really good sentiment to have. It's something that we always try to do. So, students first, and then you build from there in anything. And you touched on the buzz that you felt at the volleyball game the other day. And for audio listeners, you can see I'm surrounded by hockey jerseys. That feeling of a buzz. When a team is going to score before they've even made the attempt. And I think it's the same can definitely be said, whether that's in business or any organization, any team, you get that feeling. So yeah, definitely we'd love to have you on in a year's time, see what that buzz has converted to in terms of those results, what you've learned from this year, going into next fall as well. So David, thank you so much for joining.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.
We've really, really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everyone will take a lot of important lessons from today. So thank you.
No, thank you all. And thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things that I'm passionate about.
Fantastic.
Thanks so much.
And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for joining us on Learning Outcome Leaders. We hope you found the conversation valuable and that it gave you some ideas for how you can elevate your own student experience.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Until next time, have an amazing day.